Hey folks, I want to use this channel not only as a place for my music, but also as a resource for production, music theory, and mixing tips. So I thought it would be fun to take a little deep dive into the production of my track tonight and take a closer look at how I came about making some of the sounds and coming up with the arrangement that made this track possible. So this whole track actually started with these little vocal stab sounds that I was working on probably 2 years ago. I just had the idea and I wanted to play around with making a synth sounding thing completely out of vocals. So I recorded each individual note and then I tuned them into all the different chords and then sang extra layers over top of them. And after a bunch of tuning and processing, I got this nice full vocal stab sound. So I was really happy with this vocal stab sound. I knew that it could be the basis of a really cool track. And I had written this verse part with pianos and guitars that functioned fine and it sounded nice and pretty, but it was just too similar to the vocal stabs in that the verse sounded pretty and the chorus sounded pretty, and so there was no contrast between the two and it all felt a little bit flat. So I tried to think, what's the opposite of these bright, airy vocal stab sounds? So I deleted the whole verse and decided that the right way to go would be to make something super bass heavy and very non-melodic. So I worked on this bass patch in Massive, and it's a very simple line. It's just a repeating D with a little bit of pitch bend here and there. There's no melody happening at all in this bass. It's just this one note and this one sound that's constantly shifting in texture and shape. So I was really excited about that sound. I felt like it gave me the contrast I was looking for against these vocal stabs. I was really happy with it, but I wanted to add some more layers to it. Whenever I'm designing the primary sound for any instrumental, I like to use the same MIDI information, but apply it to multiple synths and samplers. And that way, they kind of all accumulate together and create this one cohesive sound that's more interesting than I could get out of any single patch. So I copied my MIDI line and I opened up Arturia's Pigment synth, and the default initial patch for that synth is this little bell sound, and I just liked how that patch sounded with the MIDI information I already had, so I left it the way it was. So you can hear that little bell sound is doing the same thing as the main body of the bass, but the main difference is that when the main bass jumps down an octave, the bell actually jumps up an octave, so we get this really interesting shift in texture between the first section of the verse and the second section of the verse. So I wanted to create one more layer for this core bass sound. I have a rule where I never want the listener to hear exactly the same thing twice. So at the start of the verse, we have the bass and the bell, which is the first time we've heard it. In the next loop, they jump octaves away from each other, which changes the texture in a way we haven't heard before. Then in the next loop, I bring in this metallic sound, which is much more aggressive and really kind of drives the energy of the second half of the verse. So we have all these different bass layers that are playing the same note and the same pattern, but in very different timbres, and they're jumping around in octaves in different ways, and combined all together, they sound like this. So at this point, I had two sounds I really liked, and I knew they could be sort of the instrumental hooks of the track. I had my vocal stabs and my cool bass patch, and I needed to make a whole song out of those two things. So I decided to use this song structure where all of the choruses up until the last one are actually kind of fake choruses. It actually functions more like a pre-chorus, but it's using the chorus, lyrics, and melody. So I created this little synth stab riser that feels like it's building up to something, but instead of leading you into the chorus, it just lets you down at the last second and instead goes right into the second verse. So we've arrived at the second verse, but I still have my rule where I don't want the listener to hear the same thing twice. So I'm using the same bass patch in essence, but I'm changing the way the layers are arranged. So the second verse actually starts with no drums and only the bells layer, and that one's kicked up an octave. So we've just come out of this big pre-chorus sounding build where we're expecting something huge to happen, and then right out from under us, everything cuts out, and we're left with just this small little section with the vocal and the bell layer of the bass. And then the drums kick back in, and we bring back our lower bass layer. And then in our third section, we cut back to just the bells again, but this time it's kicked up 2 octaves. And then in our fourth section, we go back to having the full bass sound, but this time I've added another layer to it, which is actually a harmony. So this is the first time we've heard this bass sound playing more than one note. So there's one more interesting element in this second verse here. I'm going to skip over a lot of the synth stuff because most of it is utilitarian more than interesting. The bass line is really the star of the show for these verses, but there was one extra part I wanted to add. There's a very key line in the lyrics where I say, "I'm getting so drunk, haven't seen my boyfriend in a few months," and it's such a funny line in the song that I wanted to use the instrumental to accent it. So I had this idea for a little melody, and I recorded this vocal sample for it, which was just to remember the idea. And then I built the synth patch around it, but I actually really liked the way the vocal sample mixed with the synth, so I left it in as part of the track. And speaking of accenting key lyrics, there's a great concept Pat Pattison talks about called prosody, which basically says that everything in the song needs to be supporting the main message at all times. So in this little line where I'm talking about being drunk, the instrumental is pretty sparse, so I had some extra room to add special effects to it. So I copied my main vocal again, and I added some really wacky reverbs to it. They're kind of spaced out, and one of them reverses, and I feel like this swirly, trippy effect kind of mimics the feeling of being drunk.
See my boyfriend in a few months. Don't know if it's weed or if it's a skunk. Me and all my girls are...
So we've made it to the second air quotes chorus. It's pretty much the same as the first one with the building pre-chorus synth stabs. But after this build-up, this here is the first time we hear those vocal stabs, the idea that started the whole track. And I knew I wanted to use those synth stabs as sort of the underlayer of the big, huge chorus, but I didn't want to give that away just yet. I really wanted to save it for my final chorus. So instead, I introduced the sound by creating more of a post-chorus section. So it starts off with just the vocal stabs, and you're like, ooh, this is cool, I haven't heard this before. And I also reinforced these vocal stabs with this little underlying bass layer. So now we've made it to the bridge of the song, and I've actually changed the structure here. Instead of using the original bridge, I actually took a verse from one of Kesha's other songs and decided to sing that for my bridge. And the vocals of this section are actually very similar to the verse vocals, so I wanted to try using my bass patch again, but change it up in a way that would make the bridge feel very distinctly different. So I used the same layers, but I actually changed the rhythm of them. So we finally made it to the real chorus of the song. This is the first time in the whole track we've heard the chorus lyrics and melody over a full instrumental instead of a pre-chorus build. Those big vocal stabs are still the core of the instrumental underneath the lyrics, but this time, unlike the post-chorus before, they're reinforced by this humongous bass patch that's mimicking the melody of the vocal stabs. So So you can see this rule of never letting the listener hear the same thing twice has really come into play here. We've heard the chorus melody before, we've heard it with all the background vocals, we've heard the vocal stabs before, but we've never heard them combined with this bass patch and with the full drums and with the full synth and band section that accompany it. So to really fill out this final chorus section, I used some extra layers of synths up above the bass, which sound like this. Now moving on to the band section, the first part of the last chorus actually plays something a little bit different. It's still playing the same chords as everything else, but it's actually living in that pre-chorus build-up vibe that we were using in previous choruses. And the reason for that is, even though this is my big final chorus, I also have a big final post-chorus that I need to get to, which means I need to leave myself somewhere to go in my levels of excitement. So the band section starts off a little bit more mellow in more of a building feeling, and then when it finally gets to the post-chorus, which is the huge high point of the song, that's when the band section reaches its full intensity and starts mimicking the same pattern as the vocal stabs. So now that we've looked at all the instrumental parts of the song, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the vocals, starting with the background vocals.
Tonight's the best night of our lives. Can you feel it? I can feel it. We got it all if we're alive. If we're breathing, we're still breathing.
So there's nothing super special going on with these background vocals. You can see it's just a huge stack of doubles and harmonies. They've all been tuned and aligned so they sit together as one cohesive unit. Probably the most interesting part of these background vocals is actually this little vocoder layer that kind of sits underneath everything, and it's using Ableton's default vocoder that's based off of this synth. So then I just copied my main vocal track for that section, I slapped a vocoder on it and side-chained that synth as an input, which sounds like this. It's pretty subtle and hard to notice in the final mix, but I feel like it adds an extra bit of texture to the background vocals that they otherwise lacked. And there's a lot of elements in production that are meant to be felt more than heard, so you don't really notice them when they're there, but if you turn them off, there's a noticeable drop in energy. So now that we've looked at all of that, let's take a quick peek at the lead vocal.
Okay, we're going out tonight, don't wanna stay home. I got my girls to call the Uber cause I can't find my phone. I'm getting ready, mani-pedi, fancy shit with the leathers. Now we're looking for some trouble like we're hunting for treasures.
So there's nothing too special going on with this vocal. One thing I did want to point out is at the bottom left of the screen, you'll notice I'm using more of an SSL style channel strip. I feel like with a lot of sounds, and especially vocals, I get a better sound if I start off with more of a blind EQ, where I just have knobs in front of me and no visualizer of the frequency spectrum. That way, any change I make, I'm forced to rely on my ear and know I'm making the right decision, rather than just tweaking things that I see on the screen and look like they might be a problem. After that, I'm running it through this Purple Audio compressor and a little bit of FabFilter Pro Q3 to remove some of the nastier frequencies. And we have basically the same thing going on here in the chorus vocal.
Tonight's the best night of our lives. Can you feel it? I can feel it. We got it all if we're alive. If we're breathing, we're still breathing. You and I, we're flying high. Gonna feel like this forever. Tonight's the best night of our lives.
Again, nothing super special happening here, although you can hear copious amounts of melodyne because this song is a bit out of my range, so I needed some help with those high notes. So now that we've looked at the vocals, let's take a quick peek at the drums. So it's a pretty basic drum pattern overall. I'm using a super simple 808 kick sound and a dark little clap, and there's some percussion elements that happen halfway through the verse. Though one thing to notice is I do have those two kick top layers, and those are both heavily high-passed, so they're not interfering with the body of the kick, but they're adding a little bit of texture on the more important hits of the drum. So even though we're hearing this 808 over and over, we're hearing different textures on top of it, which keeps it sounding more interesting. So when we get to the chorus, it's a very similar setup with the drums, except for the samples I've used. I'm using a much stronger kick and a much snappier clap, which gives the chorus more energy than the verses. I'm also using that same top layer trick that I was using on the kicks in the verses, but here I'm using it on the clap in the chorus. So each clap sounds a tiny bit different than the one before, which gives the whole drum beat a little bit more groove. And speaking of groove, there's not too much to be said about the percussion happening in this track, but let's go ahead and take a listen to the extra bit of syncopation and rhythm it adds to the last chorus. We've been listening to all these different elements in isolation, so to end this video, let's take a quick listen to how they sound combined together.
Going out tonight, don't wanna stay home. I got my girls to call the Uber cause I can't find my phone. I'm getting ready, mani-pedi, fancy shit with the leathers. Now we're looking for some trouble like we're hot. No, not. Tonight's the best night of our lives. Can you feel it? I can feel it. We got it all if we're alive. If we're breathing, we're still breathing.
So I hope you enjoyed that closer look at my production of Tonight. If you liked the track, be sure to stream it on Spotify. If there's any other topics you'd like me to cover, be sure to leave them as a comment below, and I will see you next time. Cheers!